So I had to stop knitting for almost a year because apparently there is such a thing as knitting too much, and I got a repetitive strain injury on my wrist, which is not great, but I am better now. I am excited to knit now that it's the fall, and the flip side of having knitted so much that I got an injury is that I had so much knitting that I had been doing before I injured myself, and so I am really excited to share that with you today. And it's really good to be back because I miss knitting, I miss sharing my knits. So today I have a bunch of finished pieces to share, and also I'll get you caught up on the whole knitting injury saga that I experienced, and also share a bit about what I was doing in all those months that I was not knitting, because let's be real, that was a lot of hours in my day. So yeah, thank you for being here. Thanks for coming back. If you've followed me before, I really appreciate your support. And to start, I will talk about the first finished object, which is what I'm wearing today, and it is a modified Maggie cardigan by Petite Knit. This was a whip during my last video, which was like a year ago, so of course nobody remembers it, but I have finished it many months ago and I really have been loving it. It's been one of my favorites. And to start with, a couple of the modifications that I made, obviously made it long sleeves. I also added a double knitted button band instead of the ribbed button band that was called for by Petite Knit. I feel like these were actually pretty simple modifications to make. For the sleeves, I just continue knitting, and I think I decreased every 10 rows according to my counting just before this video. And I knitted a pretty thin double knit button band, and then the top neckband is still ribbed as the picture shows, I think. And I didn't make it double knit or anything. I just knitted one layer of ribbing and finished it off with Italian bind off. The more significant modification that I made was the yarn gauge, which of course is something that you can't really tell when I'm wearing the sweater. But of course that would be a sign that it worked out versus, changing the gauge and having the fit turn out terribly, So the reason that I changed the gauge was because the pattern called for either Cardiff cashmere or the knitting for olive merino and soft silk mohair combination. And the pattern gauge is about 23 stitches per 10 centimeters. And from what I've seen, I think that gauge is just better suited for the Cardiff cashmere. Whereas for this yarn combination, I felt like that was just really tight and really stiff. And I didn't think I needed that. I've knitted with this yarn combination before. It's a very popular combination, and I really liked it at a looser gauge. And I think a lot of other patterns, even the ones by Knitting for Olive, have this at a looser gauge. And so I decided to modify that. And so by changing the stitch gauge, my row gauge proportionally also changed, which might be an artifact of just the way that I knit. And so because of that, I didn't want to risk the yoke and everything being too short because my row gauge was much less proportionally, and therefore I did some math just to change up the increase rates and the number of rows that I knitted to make sure that everything came out with the same proportions that the original pattern called for. That's usually a pretty straightforward thing to do for something like a raglan or even a drop shoulder, but for something like this construction, which I believe is called English tailoring, there was just a little bit more thinking and planning ahead that it involved. For example, if I'm knitting something that then requires picking up from the vertical edge, I just needed to make sure that the length and the width of all the pieces, both in terms of the actual length measurements like centimeters, as well as the stitch or row measurements, all kind of matched up so that when I'm there to pick up stitches, there's the right number of stitches for me to pick up, and that all the pieces just fit together. So in this case, I actually found it really helpful to write everything out in a spreadsheet so that I can reference those numbers in addition to the pattern where I'm referencing it for the steps. And I know it sounds a little bit complicated, but I don't mind doing it because it helps make sure that the piece will come out the way that I wanted, both in terms of having this looser stitch gauge and achieving the right proportions as the pattern intended. And also, I just don't really mind doing it. I think it's honestly a little bit fun. Like knitting itself is not the easiest path to getting a sweater or cardigan into my life, but I like the process. And so I think it's kind of similar of a mindset for doing all these calculations as well. So if it's not your cup of tea, totally get it. That's just what I chose to do, I guess. The next thing I wanted to talk about with this cardigan was the buttons. So I think in the last video that I posted, I was debating which buttons to get. I do have a stash of tortoiseshell buttons And I also considered like a little pearl button or something like that. But in the end, I really just wanted the buttons to kind of blend in with the rest of the fabric. And so I really wanted a good color match. I did go to my local sewing store to look for buttons, but I didn't really find anything that fit the color or the style that I wanted. So after some more research, I landed on these red Carozo buttons from Etsy. I hadn't heard of Carozo before, but doing a bit more research, it is a seed from the Carozo palm, which is a tree native to Central and Latin America. And I really like it. First of all, the color match is pretty good. And also, I just really like the look and feel of it. It definitely looks different than a plastic button, and I love the dimension that it has also. So that's a cool new button type that I learned about, and I'll definitely look out for in the future, especially if I'm trying to match, color match buttons. And the way that I sew the buttons on, which I always do now for knitwear, is something I learned from a petite knit pattern. I think it was a champagne cardigan, but I could be wrong on that, but essentially when you're knitting the button, you make sure to leave a gap between where the button sits and where the placket is so that the button isn't sitting flush on the placket. The reason is that when you're buttoning up your fabric, the fabric is thick, and so if there's no space between the button and the placket, then when you put something else in between, it just kind of puckers. And so I made sure to leave a good gap as I was sewing by putting like a little needle in between. And then after I was finished sewing the button, I wrapped the rest of the thread around the post, I suppose, of the button so that there is that spacer between the button and the placket. And I used just one strand of mohair to sew the buttons for A, good color matching, and B, it's not as thick as if I sewed it with double strands. And I was a little nervous that it wouldn't be strong enough, but I haven't had any problems with buttons falling off so far, so I'm generally very happy with how this turned out. So yes, this piece has turned out to be one of my favorites. I finished it last year, as are most of the things I'm going to show today, because they were all finished before my knitting hiatus, but I've worn this a lot. I really like the modifications that I made, especially the sleeves, because for a fabric that is this warm, it just makes more sense for me to have it be long sleeve so that I can wear it in colder occasions. And yeah, I've worn this even for dressier occasions also. Like if I were attending a wedding and this color went with my dress, I would just put it over as a little layer when it gets colder in the evening. And I just love the color a lot. I think one of the things that really made a difference in me being able to knit things that I love is knowing what color to use. And I definitely think this rusty terracotta color is just one of my favorites. It's something that people always comment on. Like even if they can't tell this is a hand knit cardigan, they'll be like, wow, like look at that color. So that definitely contributes to me really liking this piece as well. Next up, staying with the fall theme, is the first sweater that I completely self-drafted. And it is something I've dubbed my cozy chocolate sweater, obviously in reference to the color. And it is a very oversized, boxy drop shoulder sweater with a split hem that's got a little tiny bit of high-low action where the front is just a tad shorter than the back. The yarn I used is called Lang Enya, and it is a blown yarn with 63% alpaca and 37% nylon. And it's very fuzzy, it's very fluffy and lightweight, which I really liked. It's been very comfortable to wear. Whenever I get alpaca yarns, I'm always a little bit cautious of whether it would be irritating to my skin, but it has not been. This again has been such a workhorse in my wardrobe. I've worn it so much. I've traveled a lot with it. So the design of the sweater is, I think, nothing groundbreaking. There's a lot of patterns out there with a similar type of design. And I think the reason, again, that I decided to self-draft it, for one, is because I thought that it would be fun. I just wanted to see like what it would take, what it would be like to do so. And also because of the gauge of this yarn, I couldn't really find any pattern that really matched it. And so that would mean that I would have to make some modifications and recalculations anyway. And I thought, well, given that, why not just like take a stab at what it takes? It's really like more of an exercise, I guess, for me to try to self-draft than really out of a need, I guess. And it was a good learning experience, I think. And so having knit a lot of drop shoulder type of sweaters before, I had a pretty good sense of what the construction would be like. And I referenced my existing sweaters that I already have that I like the fit of for the measurements. And it was a good learning experience. Like for example, when I was trying to figure out the decrease rates for the sloped shoulder. So if you've knitted drop shoulder sweaters, you may know that a lot of designs have you knit a trapezoid in the back panel as you start. And so figuring out the slope of the shoulder and making sure that when you then go pick up stitches to get the front half of the front shoulders, to make sure that those dimensions match up was something that took a little bit of trial and error for me to figure out. But it's a helpful exercise is to see like all the factors that you have to consider when you're knitting even like a fairly simple construction like this one. And there's other little things, like I really wanted a 2x2 rib for the hem, the sleeve cuffs, and the collar as well. And so for the collar and the sleeves, I had to make sure that the number of stitches is divisible by 4, which is fairly straightforward. And also you have a little bit of leeway for things like that. Like if you're really off by just a couple of stitches at the end of the sleeve, you could, add, or you could increase or decrease a stitch or two before the cuff, and it doesn't really make a difference. I see other designers do that in their patterns as well, in patterns that I've knitted. And then similarly for the collar, you have a little bit of leeway in terms of how many stitches that you pick up as well. And then for the hem, because I did a split hem, I just had to consider what the ribbing looked like at the edges as well. So I didn't want it to be just divisible by 4, because I didn't want it to be like 2 knits, 2 purls at the beginning, and then 2 knits, 2 purls at the end as well, because on one end it would have 2 knit stitches, and the other end it would have 2 purl stitches, so it's not going to be symmetrical. So the way I did that was that, editing Ichi here to explain that a little bit clearer, I essentially also accounted for selvage stitches. So I did 1 slip stitch and 1 knit stitch at the beginning of the row, followed by 2 purl stitches to start the ribbing pattern. And then after I did my knit 2, purl 2, I ended with the purl 2 and also did a knit stitch and a slip stitch to finish off the end of the row to get a nice selvage. That is what I did. And then the collar, I did do a double knit collar because this was meant to be my cozy sweater. And so I felt like the squishiness of the double knitted collar really fit that vibe really well. And again, this is also something I've worn just a ton last cozy season, so like fall and winter. And it's also just a nice fall color. And brown has been one of my favorite colors for years, and I have always gotten made fun of for brown being my favorite color because it sounds like a weird color, right? Well, jokes on everyone else because brown is like such a popular color now. That's all I have to say about that. Next up, I have another self-drafted piece. I was basically like on a high from having knitted this sweater and having loved it so much that I thought I'd try something a little different than that. And so I have this piece, which is a half-fisherman rib cardigan, which is a raglan design, and it has a double folded ribbed neckband and a double knitted button band. The yarn that I use is also Lang Enya, so the same yarn that I use for my brown sweater as well. And I just really liked the yarn and thought I really wanted to use it for a fluffy cardigan. And the design of this cardigan, you could also find existing patterns for, but same as before, none of those patterns were at the gauge that I was able to knit with this cardigan and still liking the fabric. So I thought might as well try and figure out the measurements myself. Again, more like an exercise. I know it's not like a groundbreaking design, but just the technical exercise of like what it takes to figure out how to construct something like this. And this is also the first time I'm trying to draft something that's not in a stockinette net stitch. And I think the overall process is fairly similar. You're still basically knitting a gauge swatch to figure out how you can translate length measurements like centimeters to stitch or row measurements. So that whole process was pretty similar. I think the main additional consideration is, again, like especially for this type of cardigan where it's open in the front, trying to figure out what stitches are at the beginning of the row and what stitches are on the end of the row and making sure that they're symmetrical. And therefore, when you're calculating the number of stitches, making sure it's like divisible by the right number, plus accounting for those like edge stitches. So that was like a little bit of calculation that I had to do to figure it out. When I was knitting this sweater, because it's half fisherman rib, I definitely remember watching a lot of videos about how to fix mistakes and ladder down when you have caught a mistake in like previous rows, because for a raglan, there are just so many stitches like at the top the yoke part before you split for sleeves. So if you miss a mistake and you catch it later, it's just kind of painful to have to frog everything. Especially frogging these like fluffy blown yarns is also quite a pain. So I definitely remember having to watch those videos to figure out like where the mistake is and how to fix it. And that was extremely necessary. So if you're using, if you're knitting half-fisherman's rib for a piece, I definitely recommend learning how to fix mistakes by laddering down instead of having to frog. Yeah, so overall, I really like it and I'm very proud of it. But to be honest, I haven't worn this as much as the other pieces, like this cardigan and this brown sweater that I showed earlier. I'm not totally sure why. I think part of me wishes this was actually an oversized piece as opposed to a cropped piece, but I don't know, we shall see. Maybe now that the weather is getting colder and this is top of mind, I'll pull it out and try to style it a little bit more this season. Okay, all right, we still have more finished objects. The next one I don't have with me because it was a gift knit for my mom, and the pattern is the White Mountains by Midori Hirose. It is the original version, not the light version, and the yarn that I used was Cascade 220 Sport in the color Como Blue, held with one strand of Fiber Spades Cumulus in the color Teal. So this was a case in which I had both of those yarns bought for something else that didn't work out, and I knew that those yarns together made for my mom's favorite color, and I thought what a good chance to knit her a sweater. And I chose the White Mountains because it was about the right gauge. And it's so interesting because when you look at a stitch gauge like 13 or 14, I think the patterns might actually be 14, it just sounds so bulky to me. And I was really pleasantly surprised that with this yarn combination, although it reaches the gauge, it is still pretty light and fluffy for the gauge that it had, and I really, really, really enjoy how nice and squishy the yarn feels. It is really soft on skin. I was not sure how my mom would enjoy wearing it because she has very sensitive skin, but she said that she has no issues with it, which I was very grateful for. And she really likes it, I think. And with the pattern, the main modification I made was to loosen the sleeves a little bit. I think a lot of Midori Hirose's designs have very fitted sleeves, and I just prefer looser sleeves for comfort. And so I ended up modifying the increased rates on the raglan for the sleeves so that there are more sleeve stitches. I also remember that the raglan was a compound raglan, so it's not just a one increase rate to get a straight raglan line, but the rate of increases changes as you progress in the yoke to give some shaping, which I really, really like the way that looks. I do remember that in the pattern itself, there would be instructions to like jump to page X if you're following a certain size, or jump to a page Y if you're following a certain size. And there were also like many styles I think that you could do for the collar, etc. So I do think it would be helpful to kind of highlight what you're looking for as you go through, because I do remember sometimes accidentally looking at the wrong sections in the pattern. So that is something that I would recommend. And in terms of the pattern, I think I just opted for a ribbed collar to keep it classic. And I love the yarn combination. It was my first time using Fiber Spades Cumulus, and I really enjoy how that yarn feels. And I love how warm and cozy it feels without being heavy and something that weighs you down. So really enjoy that. And I'm really glad that my mom liked it as well. Now we have come to my final finished object for today, and it is the first piece that I finished after I returned from my knitting hiatus, which is very exciting. Granted, the majority was already knit before, I just had to finish some ribbing, but nonetheless, it is my first finished object of my new knitting season, I suppose, and it is this vest. This is knit using Laying Cloud, which is a 90% superwash merino and 10% nylon yarn. And of course you get this yarn because of how beautiful the colors are. I'll show you the back because actually I love the back even more than the front. I low-key wish that the colors in the back were in the front, but alas, this is how it turned out. I think that's the thing with these self-striping type of yarns. It's hard to predict kind of, how the patterning will look. The inspiration for this piece is Abby from What Abby Wore on Instagram. She generally has such cool knitting and sewing makes and really cool styles, so I do recommend checking out her account. But I think I've seen sometime last year that she knitted a Montpellier top using this yarn, and I thought it was just such a cool idea to have such a colorful vest. And so I decided to do something similar, but instead of using that pattern, I again decided to self-draft the pattern, and I wanted a vest that kind of had ribbing at the collar and the armholes as well. And so the pattern, like the overall design and construction, is pretty similar to the vest number 2 spring edition that I knitted twice now, and I modify the gauge and the fit based on what I wanted it. I wanted it to be, I guess, relaxed, so not oversized, but definitely not fitted either. And I also opted to knit this flat because when I tried to knit it just in the round, I did find that the stripes, like each stripe became so much skinnier, and I liked that the stripes were kind of a little bit thicker. So that was only possible if I knitted it flat, because each stripe in the self-striping yarn has kind of more rows where it can appear on one side, versus if it was knitted in the round, then like maybe the color would only show for one row on both the front and the back, and that made it just look a little bit of a different effect, I guess. And so I like these thicker stripes. Of course, at the top, I'm knitting just the shoulder flat, and therefore these sections are much bigger than the sections down below. The front, I feel like the neck part of the vest end up contributing a lot to the color that the overall vest feels like it is. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm not going to try and say it again, because if it doesn't make sense, we're just going to let that go. But anyway, this looks a lot more pale pink than I think I would have wished. I really, again, enjoy these like darker red stripes on the back, but you know, that is just what I got, and that's still fine. And because I knitted it flat, I obviously had to seam it up the side, which is not a big deal. I did also want to use just the 2 balls of yarn that I had to finish up the piece, and because of that, I did a little bit of yarn chicken. Basically, I had knitted one of the panels to the length that I thought it should be, and then started knitting, you know, like the ribbing for the armholes and the neckband and everything. But of course, after I ran out of yarn, I was knitting the other panel straight from that original panel. So like instead of knitting out of a yarn ball, I had no more yarn. So I just started unraveling one panel and knitting the other panel from it, which is kind of silly, but you know, I figured that the length is pretty flexible for something like this, especially knowing that it would grow a lot after being blocked, since it is a superwash yarn. I figured that I didn't need to get a whole other ball of yarn just to knit like another centimeter on the length. So in the end, I think it worked out. The length is pretty good. And yeah, I'm excited to wear it. I would say I think this color scheme is pretty spring. Like I think this is a much better fit for spring than fall, which it is now. But maybe like sometime in the winter I can bring this out to kind of brighten up the dreary winter days. But overall, yeah, really enjoyed it. I also realized that most of the things I shared today were knit with yarns from Ling, which I guess I'm just on a laying yarns kick, but you know, it is what it is. I've definitely been on a blown yarn kick because I really enjoy like the fluffy, halo-y type of look, and I think blown yarns are just so like airy, and yeah, I really have enjoyed knitting with these types of yarns. So that's everything that I had finished. And in terms of whips, I think I'm definitely embracing more of like a slow knitting approach. I think having paused knitting for so long definitely gave me a lot of perspective about what I wanted to be knitting. I had a ton of whips from before I had to stop knitting, but I'm just going to go back to it slowly. The one that I've been knitting on now has been the Wall Garden Pullover, which is a kit that I got in Japan, designed by Erika Tokai. It is such a beast to knit because it is very complex and tarja with like a bajillion colors, and each row is very, very different. So it is definitely going to be a labor of love, a long-term labor of love, but I'm just knitting that when I have time and when I feel up to it, versus knitting as much as I used to before. And so if you were interested in this whole knitting injury thing, I basically had gotten de Quervain's Tenosynovitis, which is when the tendon on the thumb side of my wrist, the sheath on that tendon has inflamed. And so that really limited my mobility as well as just the ability to bear weight with my right wrist. And so not only could I not knit, I also couldn't really do a lot of like daily things. Like for a while when it was really, really bad, I had a hard time like opening a doorknob, or like I couldn't even carry like a plate with this one hand. And so it was quite serious, which I definitely really regretted having it get to that point. But it's also one of those things where as it was developing, I didn't quite know that it would be that serious. Like I definitely I definitely remember feeling like discomfort and kind of like twinges when I was knitting, but I didn't think it was that bad. Like I didn't feel like I was having to push through pain to knit. I'm not quite that hardcore, I suppose. But I think at one point I just realized when I was trying to test some like general mobility things with my wrist that I couldn't do it compared to my other hand, which is when I realized something was wrong. So at first I just kind of ordered like a wrist splint online and then tried to rest. In the beginning, admittedly, I kept trying to like sneak in some knitting here and there because I'm like, oh, surely I've rested enough. But I would then feel soreness in my wrists and be like, okay, actually, I think I do need to stop. And then I did also go see an orthopedic doctor who confirmed the diagnosis. It's also known as mother's thumb because I think a lot of mothers also get this condition from the way that they pick up their children repeatedly. So it is like a common condition, I think. If this disclaimer is even necessary, I am obviously not giving medical advice. I am just a girl who wanted to stop knitting and sharing what I did, so please do not take this as medical advice. I am not a doctor. My doctor did recommend injections as one of the options. Alternatively, I could like start with prescription strength NSAIDs, so non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, like a very potent ibuprofen to decrease the inflammation in my wrist. So I decided to start with that and go to injections if I needed to, and that did help over a longer period of time. So anyway, I rested from knitting a long, long time. I also rested from other like activities I liked doing before, like pickleball or like yoga, because the planking motion really hurt my wrist as well, and also like lifting weights using your hands also kind of hurt as well. And so, yeah, just had to definitely like adapt my lifestyle because of it. So it was definitely not something to be really taken lightly. And I think the one thing that one takeaway I have from that experience is a very cliche advice of just listening to your body. I know it's easily said than done because sometimes like you just don't really know what to listen for, but I guess I do wish that I took those like early warnings more seriously when I first started to feel like my wrist was hurting, you know? So in the beginning, I definitely did a lot of like doom scrolling on Reddit about other people who've had this condition, and like, you know, you just get a lot of horror stories when you're doom scrolling on Reddit. And so it did feel very difficult because I was no longer able to do a lot of the activities that I enjoy doing, like not just knitting, but you know, also pickleball and yoga and all these other things. So I definitely moped about that for a while, but I think now that I'm, you know, a year removed from that, I definitely feel appreciative of the perspective that I got from that sudden change in my life. Like as the saying goes, like something has to be destroyed before you have room to build something new. And I'm definitely not glad that I destroyed my wrists, but I do feel like in the past year, I've learned different ways to channel my creativity in ways that I now really appreciate. And after that initial moping period, I just started to look around and being like, okay, well, what else can I do? I used to knit every single day for several hours. And so for one, I really invested more in my pottery practice. So I had been doing wheel throwing for maybe a year or two before I had to stop knitting. And when my wrist was hurting, I wasn't really comfortable wheel throwing. Like it did still hurt my wrist going through those motions. And so I signed up for a hand building class because I felt like that would be something that I could do more easily given my wrist issue. And that just really opened up a whole new world to me. Instead of just throwing, I then felt more confident hand building, but also combining the two skills, like throwing something and then cutting into it and altering it into a different shape. That also led me to taking a figurative sculpting class where I sculpted a lady based on a photo set that I never ever would have thought I would be capable of doing. And it opened up this whole new world of learning how to see and observe the human body and how much detail there is to see in something as simple as a collarbone. It was such an interesting experience and I really loved it. And I really don't think I would have had enough time to devote to both that and knitting at the same time, and you know, working and doing life things, obviously. And so those are all really cool opportunities and just allows you to be creative in a much different way than you are when you're knitting. And so besides that, I also started sewing. So that is a new skill for me. Besides very terribly attempting to thrift flip things when I was in middle school. I never really sewed before. And I think there's a pretty good overlap between knitters and sewists. And so I'd love to share more about my sewing if you guys are interested. But around last October, I started learning to sew after watching Sydney Graham's Learn to Sew series. I got myself a sewing machine, I got the basic tools, and off I was making sewn items. And I've really especially been on a sewing kick recently. And again, that's also another way of being creative. I also really enjoy just learning new skills, so that was a good opportunity to do so. When I was knitting, I was already interested in the idea of sewing, but there was just enough of a barrier to entry that I didn't really invest the time, like I had to do a lot of research about what supplies to get, like how to go about it, how to get patterns, how to get fabric. Like there's just a little bit of a startup cost that you have to invest into that. And I didn't do it because I was like, well, I can always knit. So yeah, I'd love to share more of my sewing on this channel as well. I think it's been just about a year since I started sewing because I think I bought my sewing machine in October of last year, like mid to late October of last year. So I was thinking of making an everything I sewed as a beginner type of video. If you are interested in that, please let me know. But I'm really happy for the skill that has unlocked. Like in addition to sewing clothes, I've also sewn so many other like useful things in my life, including the bag that I use to carry my tools and supplies to the pottery studio. So that's been very cool to get to learn. So it was definitely tough to get this injury and having to stop doing a lot of the activities that I loved doing at the time, but I know that in the grand scheme of things, people face far, far, far greater health challenges that are more persisting as well. So it's important to keep that perspective and just appreciate the abilities that I did still have. But having had this unchosen involuntary break from knitting helped me learn the importance of taking a break intentionally, which I am doing a lot more now, even when it's something that I really love doing, because it's just important to come up for air every now and then, even if you're having a good time. If you're still here, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I hope you're enjoying the medium of creating that is speaking to you at this time. I hope you have a great fall, and I hope to see you again here soon.